Hand over the briefcase, Mr. Sterling, or you'll never learn what was really stolen tonight. The sentence drifted across the private dining room in calm, flawless Japanese, so quietly that almost no one reacted. Almost. One young waitress did. Naomi Carter stopped just long enough for the crystal water pitcher in her hand to catch the glow of the chandelier. Her heartbeat suddenly louder than the soft jazz floating through the restaurant. The Grand Harbor Room overlooked the Chicago River from the top floor of the Ashcroft Hotel, where the city's skyline shimmered against the spring night like polished steel. Investors laughed over 12-year bourbon. Executive assistants checked messages beneath the table. Waiters moved with rehearsed precision. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked perfectly controlled. Until it wasn't. Ethan Sterling, founder and CEO of Sterling Quantum Systems, barely glanced at the three sharply dressed men who had stepped into the room without invitations. At 39, Ethan had spent his career believing every problem could be solved through negotiation, preparation, or leverage. His tailored navy suit, silver watch, and calm expression reflected the confidence of a man whose signature could move billions of dollars before breakfast. Even now, he refused to believe this interruption was anything more than an inconvenience. He adjusted the leather briefcase resting beside his chair and offered a measured smile that never reached his eyes. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "if you're looking for a meeting, my office schedules those during business hours." A few nervous chuckles escaped around the table. The strangers didn't laugh. Their leader repeated something in Japanese, this time even softer. Several executives exchanged puzzled looks. Ethan frowned, assuming it was merely another attempt to intimidate him with a language no one else understood. He had no idea someone nearby understood every single word. Naomi lowered her eyes before anyone noticed the change in her expression. 24 years old, she blended into the room the way service professionals were expected to. Crisp black uniform, hair neatly secured, comfortable shoes built for 12-hour shifts. Most guests never remembered her face 5 minutes after dessert. She had learned long ago that invisibility was part of the job. People noticed the wine, the steak, the check, rarely the person carrying them. Earlier that evening, Ethan had done exactly what countless wealthy clients did. He accepted a fresh cup of coffee without making eye contact, thanking another executive while Naomi quietly stepped away. It wasn't cruelty. It was habit, the kind of habit that slowly convinced people certain lives mattered more than others. She had ignored it, just as she always did. But now the words she had just overheard refused to leave her mind. Because the strangers weren't discussing robbery. They weren't even interested in the briefcase itself. The briefcase was only the distraction. Their real objective was something far larger, carefully timed, and already unfolding beyond the walls of the restaurant. Naomi felt her pulse quicken. She could continue serving tables, finish her shift, collect her tips, and pretend she had heard nothing. Or she could step into a situation that might cost her the job she desperately needed. Her grandmother's voice echoed through her memory, gentle but unwavering. Character isn't measured when life is easy. It's measured when silence feels safer than truth. Naomi slowly inhaled, lifting another tray as if nothing had changed. Across the room, Ethan Sterling reached for the handle of his briefcase, still convinced he understood the game unfolding around him. He didn't, and unless someone invisible chose to speak, neither would anyone else. Before we continue, if you enjoy unforgettable stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary moments, subscribe to Hidden Table. Every story reminds us that true character is revealed through courage, compassion, and the choices we make when no one is watching. Now, let's see what happens next. Naomi Carter had learned years ago that the most dangerous moments rarely announce themselves with raised voices. They arrived disguised as ordinary conversations, polite smiles, and people who appeared completely comfortable. She balanced a silver tray across one hand and continued moving through the dining room at the same steady pace, offering sparkling water to one table before quietly collecting empty glasses from another. To everyone watching, she was simply finishing another busy Friday evening shift. Inside, every sentence she had overheard replayed with frightening clarity. The Japanese was not casual. It was precise, disciplined, and carefully timed. The three strangers were coordinating each movement around specific minutes, specific people, and specific exits inside the hotel. They knew exactly where security officers rotated every 8 minutes. They knew which elevator connected directly to the executive parking garage. Most disturbing of all, they knew details that only someone with inside information should have known. Naomi carefully glanced toward Ethan Sterling. He remained seated with remarkable composure, discussing market forecasts with two investors who were trying very hard to pretend nothing unusual was happening nearby. Years of leading boardroom negotiations had trained him never to show uncertainty in public. Unfortunately, confidence and awareness were not always the same thing. He still believed the expensive leather briefcase beside his chair represented the center of the problem. Naomi knew it did not. One of the strangers quietly adjusted his watch before speaking another sentence in Japanese. The words tightened every muscle in Naomi's shoulders. The briefcase is only the signal. Once everyone follows it, move to phase 2. She nearly stopped walking. Phase 2. Whatever that meant, it sounded far more serious than a simple theft. 1,000 possibilities rushed through her mind. Corporate sabotage, confidential technology, financial manipulation. None of them felt impossible in a room filled with billion-dollar negotiations. She placed fresh coffee beside an elderly investor, smiled politely, and thanked him when he nodded without looking up from his conversation. The small exchange reminded her of countless evenings spent serving people who never imagined the staff might notice anything beyond dinner orders. They underestimated waitresses because they believed uniforms erased intelligence. Naomi had stopped taking that personally a long time ago. Instead, she listened. She observed. She remembered. That habit had started years earlier in Seattle when her mother accepted a teaching position at a cultural exchange academy. Naomi had been 15, awkward, curious, and fascinated by languages. While classmates spent afternoons at shopping malls, she spent hers volunteering in classrooms where visiting Japanese educators exchanged lessons with American students. She never considered herself gifted. She simply loved understanding people through the words they trusted most. Those afternoons slowly became years. Years became confidence. Confidence became something she rarely spoke about because life eventually demanded practical choices instead of academic dreams. Tuition bills replaced language competitions. Family responsibilities replaced college plans overseas. Restaurant shifts replaced classrooms. Yet the language had never truly left her. It waited quietly, hidden beneath everyday routines, unnoticed until this very moment. Across the room, the leader of the three visitors briefly smiled, almost satisfied, as another hotel employee rolled a luggage cart through the hallway outside the private dining room. Naomi followed his eyes instead of the cart. He was not watching the luggage. He was checking the timing. That realization settled heavily in her chest. Every movement tonight had been rehearsed. Every distraction had a purpose. Every second mattered. She knew she should alert someone immediately. She also knew how unbelievable her explanation would sound. A young waitress interrupting one of the most important corporate dinners in Chicago because she happened to understand a language no one knew she spoke. People would question her. Managers might silence her before anyone important listened. Meanwhile, the clock continued moving forward, one quiet second at a time, toward whatever phase 2 was meant to become. Naomi forced herself to breathe normally as she stepped through the polished dining room, reminding herself that panic had never solved a problem. Observation had. Patience had. She placed a fresh basket of artisan bread beside a couple celebrating an anniversary, thanked them with a warm smile, and continued toward the service station without drawing a single curious glance. The room remained wrapped in the illusion of elegance. Crystal glasses reflected golden light across the ceiling. A jazz trio played softly near the grand piano. Conversations drifted between stock prices, charitable foundations, and vacation homes along the California coast. Yet beneath the polished surface, another conversation continued in Japanese, hidden inside plain sight. The strangers had positioned themselves with remarkable precision. One remained near the entrance, casually watching everyone entering and leaving. Another stood beside a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the river walk, pretending to admire the skyline while quietly checking his watch every few moments. Their leader never took his attention away from Ethan Sterling. Naomi realized something that made her stomach tighten even further. They were not improvising. They were following a schedule. Ethan finally reached for the leather briefcase resting beside his chair after one of the investors asked about tomorrow morning's presentation. He rested one hand lightly on the handle before answering with the calm confidence that had made him one of the youngest technology billionaires in America. His company had built secure artificial intelligence systems trusted by hospitals, transportation networks, and financial institutions across the country. Investors admired him because he solved impossible problems with remarkable discipline. Employees respected him because he demanded excellence from himself before expecting it from others. Yet there was another side to Ethan that only those working around him noticed. He rarely looked beyond the title on someone's name tag. Executives received his full attention. Hotel managers earned polite acknowledgement. Servers became part of the background. Naomi could not remember him making eye contact with her even once that evening. It was not hatred. It was something quieter and perhaps more dangerous. Habit. The unconscious belief that some people existed only to keep the evening running smoothly. Her grandmother had once warned her about people like that. Do not confuse being ignored with being unimportant, she used to say. Sometimes invisible people are the only ones paying attention. Naomi remembered those words now more than ever. As she refilled another glass with sparkling mineral water, the leader spoke again in Japanese, barely moving his lips. Change of schedule. Someone is becoming suspicious. We moved 3 minutes earlier. Naomi nearly lost her composure. 3 minutes. Whatever was planned was accelerating. She instinctively searched the room again. Hotel security remained outside the ballroom entrance, chatting politely with arriving guests. The restaurant manager was helping a visiting senator greet donors at another table. No one appeared alarmed because nothing alarming had happened. That was exactly what frightened Naomi. The most dangerous plans often depended on looking perfectly ordinary until the final moment. She slipped quietly into the service hallway carrying an empty tray, giving herself only a few seconds to think. Calling hotel security without evidence could trigger confusion that might make everything worse. Interrupting Ethan publicly would almost certainly get her removed from the event before she finished a single sentence. She needed proof. Something undeniable. As she turned back toward the dining room, she noticed one detail she had overlooked before. A fourth man, dressed almost identically to the hotel's catering staff, wheeled a polished service cart toward the private elevators. His uniform looked convincing from a distance, but the hotel logo stitched above the pocket was slightly outdated, a design the Ashcroft Hotel had retired more than a year earlier. Naomi's pulse quickened. The strangers were not simply surrounding Ethan. They already had someone inside the operation. Whatever Phase 2 truly meant, it had already begun, and unless someone connected the pieces before the clock reached those missing 3 minutes, the entire evening was about to change in ways no one inside the Grand Harbor room could possibly imagine. Naomi stepped back into the Grand Harbor room with the empty tray resting against her hip, forcing her breathing to match the slow rhythm of the music. Nothing in the room suggested that time had suddenly become the most valuable thing anyone possessed. Guests continued discussing quarterly earnings, charitable foundations, and summer homes along Lake Michigan. Servers exchanged quiet smiles while delivering dessert plates decorated with dark chocolate curls and fresh raspberries. From the outside, it remained another flawless evening for Chicago's business elite. Only Naomi could hear the invisible countdown ticking beneath every polite conversation. She watched the man in the outdated catering uniform disappear through the hallway, leading toward the executive conference suites. No legitimate employee should have been there without authorization. She knew the hotel well enough to recognize every service corridor, every employee entrance, and every restricted area. Something was moving behind the elegant performance unfolding in front of hundreds of unsuspecting eyes. Ethan Sterling rose from his chair after receiving a discreet message from his chief financial officer. He picked up the leather briefcase and excused himself with an apologetic smile, explaining that he needed only a few minutes before returning to finalize tomorrow's partnership announcement. The investors nodded without concern. They trusted Ethan's discipline because it had built one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country. As Ethan crossed the room, the leader of the three strangers casually adjusted his tie. It looked insignificant until Naomi heard another sentence in Japanese. He is moving exactly as expected. Maintain distance. Do not rush. Naomi's pulse climbed another notch. They were not reacting to Ethan. They were directing him. She quickly scanned the room for anyone who might believe her. The restaurant manager was still occupied greeting distinguished guests. Hotel security remained stationed near the ballroom entrance, focused on arrivals rather than departures. Every possible source of help was looking in the wrong direction. Naomi considered following Ethan immediately, but another quiet exchange in Japanese stopped her. Wait until he reaches the corridor. The signal will come from upstairs. Upstairs. That single word changed everything. Whatever phase 2 involved was not happening inside the dining room at all. The restaurant was merely the opening act. Naomi set her tray onto the nearest service station and picked up a fresh pot of coffee, using it as the perfect excuse to move naturally through the room. Years of restaurant work had taught her something surprisingly valuable. People noticed confidence far less than hesitation. A server carrying coffee belonged anywhere. Someone running toward a billionaire would immediately attract attention. She kept her pace steady while following the route Ethan had taken only moments earlier. As she reached the hallway connecting the dining room to the executive elevators, she noticed something else that did not belong. One of the digital security displays beside the elevator briefly flickered before returning to normal. Most guests would never have noticed. Naomi did. The hotel had installed those encrypted access panels only 6 months earlier after a major renovation. They were designed specifically to prevent unauthorized entry into executive floors. Yet the brief interruption suggested someone had already tampered with the system. A maintenance technician passing nearby glanced at the panel with mild confusion before continuing down the corridor, apparently assuming it was a harmless software delay. Naomi wished she could believe the same thing. Ahead, Ethan waited patiently for the elevator, checking a message on his phone while holding the briefcase at his side. He remained completely unaware that 3 different sets of eyes were quietly following every movement he made. Naomi's grandmother had always insisted that courage rarely felt dramatic. Most of the time it looked like one ordinary person deciding not to walk away. Standing only a few yards behind Ethan, Naomi realized that decision now belonged entirely to her. If she stayed silent for even another minute, whatever careful plan had been unfolding all evening would move one step closer to becoming impossible to stop. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that sounded almost ordinary, yet Naomi could no longer trust anything that felt ordinary. Ethan Sterling stepped inside alone, still carrying the dark leather briefcase with the calm confidence of a man following a familiar routine. Before the doors fully closed, one of the strangers casually approached from the opposite hallway and entered the elevator without saying a word. Anyone watching would have assumed they were simply 2 guests heading to another floor. Naomi knew better. She caught one final sentence in Japanese just before the doors slid shut. Do not touch the briefcase until the confirmation arrives. Her heartbeat skipped. That was the second time they had delayed taking the case. If robbery had truly been their goal, they had already passed several easy opportunities. Instead, they kept waiting for instructions from someone else. That meant the briefcase itself was never the real prize. Naomi reached the elevator a moment too late and watched the digital display climb toward the executive conference level. She considered pressing the call button immediately, but another movement caught her attention. The second stranger quietly disappeared through the emergency stairwell without hesitation, as though he already knew exactly where the elevator would stop. Different routes, same destination. Every piece of the puzzle fit together a little more clearly. She quickly turned toward the service corridor, where employees used a separate elevator reserved for hotel staff. During her first month at the Ashcroft Hotel, she had memorized every hallway after getting lost twice during a convention weekend. Most people believed waitresses only learned table numbers. In reality, experienced servers learned entire buildings because efficiency meant better service and better tips. Tonight, that knowledge suddenly became priceless. The service elevator arrived almost immediately. Inside stood Harold Benson, a 62-year-old maintenance supervisor who had worked at the hotel longer than almost anyone else. Harold smiled when he recognized Naomi. Busy night, he asked. Naomi forced a calm expression. Busier than usual. Has anyone reported problems with the executive floor security panels? Harold frowned thoughtfully. Actually, yes. The computer logged a brief interruption about 10 minutes ago, but then everything reset before I could inspect it. Strange timing. Naomi thanked him as the elevator continued upward. Another confirmation. The security system had not malfunctioned by accident. Someone had prepared the building before the dinner even began. When the doors opened onto the executive level, the atmosphere felt completely different from the lively restaurant below. Thick carpet softened every footstep. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline stretching beneath the night sky. Conference rooms lined both sides of the corridor, each protected by modern access panels glowing with small blue lights. Ethan had already disappeared around the far corner. Naomi moved carefully, carrying an empty coffee tray she had picked up downstairs, so she still looked exactly like what everyone expected her to be. Another hotel employee finishing routine service. She rounded the corner just enough to see Ethan speaking with two senior executives outside the Skyline boardroom. His briefcase remained in his hand. A few yards away, the stranger who had entered the elevator stood quietly beside a decorative sculpture, pretending to answer messages on his phone. At nearly the same moment, the man who had taken the stairs emerged from another hallway and gave the smallest nod imaginable. Naomi followed their eyes instead of their movements. Both men were watching the conference room door, not Ethan himself. Then another sentence drifted through the silence in careful Japanese. The transfer begins when the presentation starts. The briefcase only keeps everyone's attention where we want it. Naomi felt the truth settle into place with chilling clarity. They had never planned to steal what Ethan was carrying. They wanted every important person in the building focused on the briefcase, while something far more valuable changed hands somewhere else. The distraction was the strategy, and unless she found a way to make Ethan listen before that boardroom door opened, everyone in the hotel would spend the rest of the night protecting the wrong thing. Naomi remained perfectly still behind the hallway service station, her fingers tightening around the handle of the empty coffee tray without making a sound. She had finally uncovered enough pieces to understand the shape of the trap, yet understanding it and convincing someone else were two completely different battles. Ethan Sterling stood only a short distance away, speaking confidently with his executives about market expansion and tomorrow's investor announcement. Every sentence he delivered reflected years of discipline and preparation. Every person around him listened because his title demanded attention. Naomi wondered if anyone would give even 10 seconds to a waitress carrying nothing but an unbelievable warning. The conference room doors opened, revealing a polished space surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Chicago skyline. A presentation screen glowed softly at the far end of the room while assistants arranged folders and bottled water at each leather chair. Everything appeared exactly as a billion-dollar strategy meeting should. That was precisely why the hidden danger blended so perfectly into the background. One of the strangers quietly adjusted his cuff before speaking again in Japanese. Once they begin discussing the proposal, every eye will stay inside the room. Nobody will notice the exchange. Naomi followed his gaze instead of his words. It was not directed toward Ethan. It landed briefly on a narrow hallway leading to the executive records office, an area rarely visited during evening events. The realization settled over her like cold rain. The presentation itself was never the objective. It was simply the distraction that would keep every important witness looking in the wrong direction. She looked toward the records hallway and noticed a cleaning cart parked beside the entrance. Housekeeping normally completed that floor before 6 o'clock. It was now nearly 8:30. The cart should not have been there. Even stranger, no employee stood nearby. Naomi slowly approached, pretending to straighten folded towels stacked neatly across the top shelf. Hidden beneath a fresh linen cloth sat an electronic access badge without a hotel identification sticker. Every legitimate employee badge carried the Ashcroft logo in silver lettering. This one was completely blank. Someone had intentionally left it there for another person to retrieve. Her breathing slowed as another memory surfaced. During new employee orientation, the hotel's security director had explained that blank access cards could temporarily unlock maintenance corridors before receiving permanent programming. In the wrong hands, they could become invisible keys. Naomi carefully returned the towel exactly where she found it. Touching the badge would only alert whoever expected to collect it. She needed someone with authority, but authority required evidence, and evidence required time that was disappearing by the second. Behind her, Ethan thanked one executive before stepping into the boardroom with the briefcase still in his hand. The strangers remained outside, calm and patient, almost as though they preferred him inside. That detail confirmed everything Naomi feared. They were not interested in confronting him. They needed him occupied. As the boardroom doors began closing, Naomi made a decision she had been avoiding since the first Japanese sentence reached her ears downstairs. Waiting for someone else to notice was no longer an option. She could lose her job. She could embarrass herself. She could be dismissed before finishing a single sentence. None of those possibilities mattered anymore. Her grandmother had been right all those years ago. Character was measured when silence felt safer than truth. Naomi set the coffee tray aside, straightened her uniform, and walked toward the boardroom entranced with steady steps, determined that before another minute passed, Ethan Sterling would finally hear the one voice he had overlooked all evening. Naomi reached the closing boardroom doors just before they sealed shut. One of Ethan Sterling's senior assistants stepped into her path with a polite but unmistakable smile. "I am sorry, this meeting is restricted to executives only." Naomi nodded respectfully, lowering her voice instead of raising it. "I understand. I only need 30 seconds with Mr. Sterling. It is important." The assistant glanced at her uniform before offering the same practiced expression people reserved for requests they had already decided to deny. "If this is about catering, please speak with the banquet manager." Naomi felt the opportunity slipping away. Inside the conference room, chairs slid across the polished floor as executives settled into their seats. The presentation screen illuminated the room with a soft blue glow while Ethan placed his leather briefcase beside the conference table. Outside, the strangers remained astonishingly calm. They were not anxious because they believed everything was unfolding exactly according to plan. Naomi looked past the assistant for only a fraction of a second and caught another whispered exchange in Japanese. "The boardroom is secure. The records corridor is clear. Wait for the final confirmation." The words settled like a stone in her chest. There was no longer room for doubt. She took one careful step forward and spoke before fear could silence her. "Please tell Mr. Sterling that someone outside is discussing him in Japanese." The assistant blinked in confusion. "Japanese?" Naomi nodded. "They believe no one understands them." "I do." Before the assistant could answer, Ethan's voice drifted from inside the room. "What is happening?" The assistant turned and explained that a waitress insisted she had urgent information. Ethan appeared at the doorway with restrained impatience. His expression reflected the same quiet confidence Naomi had noticed throughout the evening. He looked at her for the first time since arriving at the hotel, though his attention carried more curiosity than trust. "Is something wrong with the service?" he asked. Naomi met his eyes without hesitation. "No, sir. Something is wrong with tonight." Ethan studied her for a moment, clearly uncertain whether to end the conversation immediately. Around the conference table, several executives exchanged puzzled glances. Time felt painfully slow. Naomi knew she would have only one chance. "The men downstairs are speaking Japanese," she said calmly. "They are not planning to take your briefcase. They have repeated that several times. The briefcase is only meant to distract everyone while another operation happens somewhere else in this building." Silence settled across the doorway. One executive gave a faint, skeptical laugh before quickly stopping. Ethan folded his arms. "You understand Japanese?" Naomi answered in fluent Japanese instead of English. The sentence was clear, confident, and natural. Without missing a beat, she translated the exact words she had heard only moments earlier. "The boardroom is secure. The records corridor is clear. Wait for the final confirmation." Ethan's expression changed almost imperceptibly. It was not belief yet. It was surprise. Before anyone could respond, one of the strangers standing farther down the hallway instinctively turned toward Naomi. For the first time that evening, uncertainty crossed his face. He had expected complete invisibility. Instead, someone had repeated his private conversation word for word. The brief moment lasted only seconds, yet it confirmed everything Naomi needed. She quietly pointed toward the abandoned cleaning cart beside the records corridor. "There is also a blank access badge hidden beneath the towels. I did not touch it because whoever placed it there is expecting someone else to collect it. If I am wrong, I will accept whatever consequences follow. But if I am right, every minute we spend protecting the briefcase gives the real plan another minute to succeed." Ethan looked from Naomi to the hallway, then toward the strangers whose calm confidence had suddenly become noticeably more careful. For the first time in years of leading billion-dollar negotiations, he realized the most valuable intelligence in the building had not come from an executive, a consultant, or a security expert. It had come from the young waitress everyone, including him, had overlooked. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories where the most overlooked people reveal the greatest strength, subscribe to Hidden Table. Here, every story reminds us that courage, integrity, and kindness can come from the most unexpected places. Now, let's see what happened next. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The quiet inside the executive hallway felt heavier than the conversations that had filled the ballroom below. Ethan Sterling did not take his eyes off Naomi Carter. He had spent 2 decades evaluating investors, negotiating acquisitions, and reading people whose fortunes depended on convincing him to believe impossible promises. What stood before him now was different. The young waitress was not asking for recognition. She was not asking for a reward. She was asking him to question everything he thought he understood about the evening. Ethan slowly turned toward his chief financial officer. "Stay here," he said calmly. "Do not begin the presentation until I return." The executives exchanged uncertain glances, but none of them argued. Something in Ethan's voice had changed. It carried the cautious tone of a leader who had decided that ignoring new information would be a greater risk than investigating it. Naomi quietly led him toward the abandoned cleaning cart outside the records corridor. She never reached beneath the folded towels herself. Instead, she stepped aside. "Please check it yourself." Ethan carefully lifted the top towel. Resting exactly where Naomi had described sat the blank access badge. His expression hardened. He handed it to the hotel's security supervisor, who had just arrived after receiving an urgent message from Ethan's assistant. The supervisor frowned immediately. "This is not authorized property," he said. "These temporary cards are supposed to remain inside our secure equipment room." He scanned the badge with a portable reader clipped to his belt. The small screen flashed a warning. "Temporary credentials. Recently activated. Executive floor access only." Ethan looked back at Naomi, no longer with skepticism, but with focused attention. "You said there was more." Naomi nodded. "The people downstairs kept repeating that the briefcase is only a distraction. They are waiting for something called the final confirmation." They also mentioned the records corridor several times. The security supervisor immediately contacted the hotel's operations office through his radio. Within moments, a quiet verification began. Cameras were reviewed. Electronic door logs were checked. No alarms sounded. No guests were interrupted. Everything remained discreet, almost invisible, because creating unnecessary panic could easily help whoever had planned the operation. A minute later, another supervisor approached at a brisk but controlled pace. "We found something unusual," he reported. "A maintenance access door near the Executive Records Archive was opened 8 minutes ago, using temporary credentials. There was no scheduled work order for that area." Ethan felt the pieces begin fitting together. He glanced toward the closed boardroom where dozens of executives were patiently waiting for a meeting that suddenly seemed far less important than it had 5 minutes earlier. Naomi remained silent. She had said everything she could prove. The next decisions belonged to people with authority. Down the hallway, one of the strangers glanced briefly toward the security supervisors before calmly walking away, disappearing around a distant corner without drawing attention. Naomi noticed another detail. He did not appear surprised, almost as though he expected the first layer of the plan to be discovered eventually. That realization unsettled her even more. If exposing the distraction did not concern him, perhaps the real objective had already moved somewhere else. Almost at the same instant, a message appeared on the security supervisor's handheld device. He read it once, then looked directly at Ethan. "Sir, one encrypted storage cabinet inside the Executive Records office was accessed exactly 90 seconds ago. According to the system log, nothing appears to be missing." Ethan frowned. "Appears?" The supervisor nodded slowly. "The cabinet was opened and closed in less than 30 seconds. Whoever entered knew exactly what they were looking for." Naomi quietly remembered another Japanese sentence she had almost overlooked earlier in the evening. "The transfer begins when the presentation starts." Suddenly, its meaning became unmistakably clear. They had never planned to steal something anyone would immediately notice. They intended to exchange one item for another, leaving everyone convinced that nothing had changed until long after the meeting was over. Ethan looked at Naomi with a mixture of surprise and growing respect. For the first time that night, he realized the most important question was no longer whether she had been right. It was how many more pieces of the plan only she could still understand before it was too late. The executive hallway suddenly became a place where every ordinary detail demanded a second look. Ethan Sterling watched the security supervisors move with quiet efficiency instead of urgency, careful not to alert the dozens of influential guests still waiting inside the Skyline boardroom. The evening could not collapse into confusion. Too many companies, too many investors, and too many confidential negotiations depended on keeping everyone calm. Yet beneath that polished calm, an invisible race had already begun. Ethan turned toward Naomi with a question he never imagined asking a hotel waitress. Tell me everything you remember. Every word. Every detail. Even if it seems unimportant. Naomi closed her eyes for only a moment, replaying every Japanese sentence exactly as she had heard it. She translated each phrase slowly, preserving the tone as carefully as the meaning. She described the repeated references to timing, the briefcase as a distraction, the executive records corridor, the final confirmation, and the mysterious transfer that would happen while every important person focused on the presentation. No embellishment. No guesses. Only facts. Ethan listened without interrupting. Years in business had taught him that accurate observers often noticed patterns long before experts did. When Naomi finished, he looked toward the security supervisor. Can your team verify whether anything inside the records office was replaced rather than removed? The supervisor paused before answering. That is much harder to detect immediately, but we can compare the cabinet inventory against our digital verification logs. Another officer quietly arrived carrying a secure tablet connected to the hotel's surveillance network. The video feed showed the executive records corridor from several camera angles. For nearly 15 minutes, nothing appeared unusual. Then Naomi leaned closer to the screen. Stop right there. The recording froze. A catering employee crossed the hallway, pushing a polished beverage cart. Everything looked perfectly normal until Naomi pointed toward the cart's lower storage shelf. That compartment was empty when I passed him downstairs. The supervisor enlarged the image. Hidden behind folded linen sat a slim metallic document case that had not been visible only moments earlier. The employee continued walking naturally toward the executive records office before disappearing beyond the camera's view. 31 seconds later, he returned pushing the same cart. This time the lower compartment looked empty again. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Can we identify him? The supervisor immediately searched the employee database. Seconds later, another alert appeared. No matching employee identification. The uniform matched the hotel. The person wearing it did not. A quiet silence settled over the group. Naomi suddenly remembered another sentence she had almost dismissed because it sounded insignificant at the time. She spoke before the memory disappeared. There was one more phrase. They said, the original never leaves the building. Only the copy travels. Ethan stared at her. Are you certain? She nodded without hesitation. That sentence stood out because it did not sound like they were stealing something. It sounded like they were exchanging something. The security supervisor immediately contacted the executive records manager, requesting verification of every confidential document scheduled for tomorrow's investor presentation. While they waited, Ethan looked through the glass wall into the boardroom where executives continued reviewing financial projections, completely unaware that the real threat had never been directed at them. Minutes later, the records manager answered with visible confusion. Every confidential folder appeared to be exactly where it belonged. Every seal remained intact. Every inventory number matched the database. Then he hesitated. There is one strange detail, he admitted. One engineering proposal weighs almost half a pound more than our archive record indicates. No one spoke. Ethan slowly realized what Naomi had understood before anyone else. The plan had never depended on taking information away. It depended on leaving something behind that no one would think to question until after the most important business decision of the year had already been made. The hallway remained remarkably quiet, yet the silence no longer felt reassuring. It felt deliberate, as though the entire hotel had become a carefully arranged chessboard where every piece had already been moved except the last one. Ethan Sterling accepted the engineering proposal from the executive records manager and placed it gently on a polished conference table inside a nearby private office. Around him stood only a handful of trusted people, the security supervisor, the records manager, his chief financial officer, and Naomi Carter. Minutes earlier, she had been another waitress serving coffee. Now every decision in the room depended, at least in part, on what she had noticed. The records manager carefully compared the folder against archived photographs stored in the company's secure document system. At first glance, every page appeared authentic. Every signature matched. Every divider sat exactly where it belonged. Even the security seal looked untouched. Then he paused. "This binding clip is different," he said quietly. "We stopped using this manufacturer almost a year ago." Ethan leaned closer. The difference was almost invisible. Without the archived image beside it, no one would have questioned it. The records manager carefully removed the clip, revealing a second layer beneath the document cover. Folded inside was an ultra-thin storage card, no larger than a postage stamp, secured so neatly that it blended into the folder itself. Nobody reached for it immediately. The discovery was significant enough that preserving the evidence mattered more than satisfying anyone's curiosity. The security supervisor photographed the folder before placing the storage card into a protective evidence sleeve. "Whatever this contains," he said calmly, "someone expected it to leave this building tomorrow inside an ordinary business presentation." Ethan slowly exhaled. He understood the implications immediately. If the altered proposal had been presented during tomorrow's investor meeting, the folder could have traveled through multiple offices, conference rooms, and transportation checkpoints without attracting a second glance. The exchange would have looked completely legitimate because everyone would have been focused on the presentation itself rather than the folder carrying it. Naomi quietly remembered another small detail from earlier in the evening. "There was one phrase I did not understand at first," she said. "One man said, 'The buyer never meets the messenger.' At the time it sounded unimportant, but now I think they expected someone completely innocent to carry that folder without ever knowing what was hidden inside." Ethan looked at her thoughtfully, meaning whoever transported it would never realize they had become part of the plan. Naomi nodded. Exactly. The realization settled heavily across the room. The operation had not relied on dramatic confrontations or obvious theft. It relied on ordinary routines, trusted procedures, and people doing exactly what they always did. That made it far more difficult to detect. The security supervisor received another update through his earpiece. After listening for several seconds, he turned back toward the group. "Our review of the surveillance footage found something else." The catering employee entered the executive floor using a temporary credential, but he never exited through any monitored elevator or stairwell. Ethan frowned. "That is impossible." "Normally, yes," the supervisor replied. "Unless someone with authorized access escorted him through a restricted service passage that is not covered by guest cameras." The words hung in the air. Naomi slowly looked toward the boardroom, where senior executives continued waiting for Ethan's presentation to begin. Until that moment, everyone had assumed the people behind the scheme were outsiders pretending to belong. Now another possibility emerged. Someone already trusted inside the event might have quietly opened the final door. Ethan followed Naomi's gaze, and for the first time that evening he stopped thinking like a chief executive protecting a business deal. He started thinking like a leader responsible for every person who had placed their confidence in him. He turned to Naomi with genuine respect in his voice. "You noticed what every one of us overlooked. From this moment forward, I want you beside us. If they are still communicating in Japanese, you may be the only person who can tell us what happens next before they do." Naomi stood beside the conference room entrance, still wearing the same black server's uniform she had put on hours earlier, yet the room around her had changed completely. Nobody saw a waitress anymore. They saw the one person who had transformed scattered details into a clear picture before anyone else recognized there was a picture to see. Ethan Sterling noticed it too. Respect did not arrive all at once. It arrived quietly, replacing assumptions one fact at a time. The security supervisor gathered the small team around the surveillance monitor as technicians continued reviewing camera feeds from every executive floor. Most hallways remained uneventful. Guests walked between meetings. Hotel staff delivered refreshments. Cleaning crews followed their normal schedules. Everything looked exactly as it should. Then Naomi raised one hand. "Go back 5 seconds." The technician reversed the recording. On the screen, the disguised catering employee disappeared through a service passage with an empty beverage cart. Moments later, another hotel employee exited the same corridor carrying a folded banquet tablecloth over one arm. Nothing about him appeared suspicious until Naomi leaned closer. Pause it there. The image froze. Ethan looked carefully, but saw nothing unusual. Naomi pointed toward the employee's polished dress shoes. Those are not hotel shoes. The security supervisor frowned. How can you tell? Naomi answered without hesitation. Ashcroft requires every service employee to wear slip-resistant rubber soles. Those shoes have leather soles. They belong with a business suit, not a catering uniform. The technician zoomed in. She was right. The shoes reflected the hallway lights like polished leather. Every legitimate hotel employee on the recordings wore identical black work shoes with textured rubber bottoms. Ethan slowly shook his head in disbelief. The disguise had been convincing enough to fool everyone except someone who actually worked there every day. The security supervisor immediately contacted officers positioned throughout the hotel, quietly sharing the updated description. Within minutes, another message arrived. One of the officers had located the abandoned catering jacket inside a maintenance closet 2 floors below. The name badge attached to the uniform belonged to an employee who had called in sick that morning. Whoever had planned the operation had studied hotel procedures with extraordinary care. Ethan folded his arms as another realization surfaced. Someone gave them that information. Nobody argued. It was the only explanation that made sense. The false uniform, the temporary credentials, the maintenance schedules, the conference timing, and the document exchange all required detailed knowledge available only to someone familiar with the hotel and the event itself. Before anyone could continue, quiet voices drifted from the far end of the hallway. Naomi instinctively turned toward the sound. 2 of the strangers were speaking again in Japanese, believing they remained unheard. She listened carefully, translating almost as quickly as they spoke. The replacement has been delivered. Leave immediately. The partner inside will finish the final step. Ethan's expression sharpened. Partner inside. Naomi nodded. There is someone else. They are not waiting for the outsiders anymore. Whoever is helping them is still here. The hallway suddenly felt much smaller. Every executive, every consultant, every vendor, and every temporary contractor attending the evening's events became a possible unknown. The security supervisor quietly instructed his team to restrict access between floors without alarming the guests. Meanwhile, Ethan looked toward the boardroom where trusted colleagues continued waiting for a meeting that no longer mattered. He realized the greatest threat had never entered through the hotel's front entrance. It had already earned everyone's confidence long before tonight. Naomi replayed the final Japanese sentence once more in her mind. One word continued bothering her because it did not fit the rest of the conversation. She finally spoke. They did not call that person an accomplice. They called that person the curator. Ethan frowned thoughtfully. Curator? Naomi nodded. That suggests the final objective was never money. It was information. Someone wanted access to knowledge valuable enough to protect, preserve, and quietly move without anyone realizing it had ever changed hands. The next 15 minutes unfolded with remarkable restraint, almost as though everyone involved understood that the smallest unnecessary reaction could undo everything they had managed to uncover. Hotel security quietly redirected guests away from the executive records corridor under the pretense of preparing another private meeting. The presentation inside the Skyline boardroom was delayed by what attendees believed was a routine technical issue. No announcements echoed through the hotel. No alarms interrupted the evening. The operation remained invisible to nearly everyone except the handful of people who now understood how close they had come to making an irreversible mistake. Ethan Sterling stood beside Naomi Carter near the conference room windows overlooking the Chicago River. For the first time that evening, he was not studying financial reports or investor projections. He was replaying every interaction he had shared with her since arriving at the hotel. The coffee she had quietly refilled. The empty plate she had cleared without acknowledgement. The brief moment she had wished him a pleasant evening while he answered another executive instead of looking at the person speaking. None of those moments had seemed important then. They mattered now. The security supervisor approached carrying a sealed evidence envelope containing the altered engineering proposal and the concealed storage card. Our technology team completed a preliminary review, he said. The storage device appears designed to transfer encrypted engineering data during routine document handling. Nothing has been accessed because we isolated it immediately. Ethan slowly nodded, meaning if Naomi had remained silent, someone attending tomorrow's investor meeting could have transported it across the country without ever realizing it existed. That is our assessment, the supervisor replied. Another investigator joined the conversation carrying updated surveillance photographs. The disguised catering employee had entered the hotel under a false identity several hours before the dinner began, but every movement after that relied on legitimate hotel routines and authorized schedules. Nothing in the plan depended on force or public confrontation. It depended entirely on ordinary people trusting familiar procedures without asking unusual questions. Ethan looked toward Naomi. You recognized the pattern because you knew the routine. She offered a modest smile. When you work in the same building every day, small changes become easier to notice than big ones. Those simple words stayed with Ethan. Throughout his career, he had hired consultants with impressive resumes, analysts with advanced degrees, and specialists from the country's top universities. Yet tonight, the most valuable observation had come from someone whose experience existed outside every executive report he had ever reviewed. He realized leadership was not only about listening to the loudest voices around the table. Sometimes it meant noticing the quiet ones who understood the room better than anyone else. The security supervisor received one final update before placing his radio back on his belt. The individuals connected to the operation have all departed the property without causing further disruption. Their temporary access methods have been disabled, the compromised records secured, and the relevant information has been transferred to the appropriate investigative authorities for follow-up. Ethan accepted the report with a thoughtful nod. The immediate crisis had ended, not because of extraordinary technology or expensive security systems, but because one overlooked observation interrupted a carefully constructed chain of assumptions. As executives slowly returned to the boardroom, believing the evening would simply continue as planned, Ethan remained standing beside Naomi for another quiet moment. The city lights reflected across the windows, turning the glass into a mirror. For the first time all night, he noticed not the skyline behind them, but the reflection of the young woman who had spent hours serving everyone else before anyone had bothered to truly see her. In that reflection, he recognized something his success had slowly allowed him to forget. The value of a person is never determined by the uniform they wear, the title on their name badge, or the seat they occupy at the table. Sometimes the person standing quietly beside the table is the one protecting everyone gathered around it. 3 weeks later, the Ashcroft Hotel looked exactly as it always had. Business travelers hurried through the marble lobby with rolling suitcases. Couples gathered beneath towering floral arrangements for afternoon tea. Executives spoke quietly over espresso before disappearing into elevators carrying schedules too full and phones that never seemed to stop vibrating. The building had returned to its familiar rhythm, and to almost everyone who entered, nothing remarkable had happened there. That was the strange thing about unforgettable moments. They rarely changed the world overnight. They changed people instead. Naomi Carter had returned to her regular schedule only 2 days after the investigation concluded. She never asked for interviews. She never posted about the evening online. She never told guests that one ordinary shift had quietly prevented a carefully planned operation from succeeding. She simply arrived early, tied her apron, greeted her co-workers with the same warm smile, and treated every guest with the same quiet professionalism she had always believed reflected her character more than her circumstances. She understood something many people never learned. Recognition could disappear as quickly as applause. Integrity stayed long after both were gone. Late one Thursday afternoon, the restaurant manager walked across the dining room, holding a small envelope with Naomi's name written neatly across the front. "Someone asked me to give you this personally," he said. Inside was a handwritten note. It contained only one sentence. "Would you allow me to thank you properly over coffee after your shift?" There was no company logo, no executive title, only a signature. Ethan Sterling. Naomi looked toward the front windows, where a familiar navy blue sedan waited outside the hotel entrance. For a moment, she considered declining, not because she held resentment, but because she believed gratitude did not always require another conversation. Still, something about the simplicity of the invitation felt sincere. An hour later, they sat together in a quiet neighborhood coffee shop several blocks from the hotel, far away from investors, security teams, conference rooms, and expensive suits. Ethan had intentionally chosen a place where nobody knew who he was. He arrived without assistants, without bodyguards, and without the leather briefcase that had unknowingly become the center of so many wrong assumptions. He placed 2 coffees on the table before speaking. "I spent years believing leadership meant always having the right answers," he said softly. "That night taught me something far more valuable. Leadership begins by making sure you are listening to the right people." Naomi smiled gently, but did not interrupt. Ethan continued, "I realized something else. I thank you for saving confidential information, but I never apologized for something much simpler." He paused, meeting her eyes with complete honesty. "I never truly saw you until I needed you. I am sorry." Naomi remained quiet for a moment before answering. "Most people believe respect begins after someone proves they deserve it. I think it should begin long before that." Ethan nodded slowly. The sentence stayed with him because it carried no bitterness. It carried truth. He reached into his jacket and placed a business card on the table. "There will always be a place for you at Sterling Quantum Systems if you ever want one. Not because you saved my company, because you see what other people miss." Naomi looked at the card before sliding it gently back toward him. "I appreciate that more than you know," she said with genuine warmth. "But right now I think I am exactly where I need to be." Ethan looked surprised. "You want to stay at the hotel?" Naomi smiled. "For now. Every day, I meet people who think they know the value of someone within 5 seconds. Maybe my job is to remind them, quietly, that they do not." Ethan laughed softly, not because the answer was amusing, but because it carried a wisdom money had never taught him. As they stood to leave, he extended his hand. Naomi accepted it without hesitation. There were no photographers, no reporters, no dramatic speeches. Just 2 people walking out into a cool Chicago evening with a deeper understanding of one another than either had expected a few weeks earlier. Sometimes justice is not measured by punishment. Sometimes redemption is not measured by wealth. Sometimes the greatest victory belongs to the person who never stopped choosing kindness, even when the world failed to notice. And sometimes the most important lesson in the room comes from the one person nobody thought to hear until she quietly changed the ending for everyone. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Hidden Table and join a community that believes true character is revealed not by power or status, but by courage, integrity, and kindness. Thank you for watching. And until next time, we'll save you a seat at the Hidden Table.